European leaders are expected to discuss Donald Trump's latest tariff threats as they gather today in Brussels.
The United States are applying tariffs worth $28 billion. We are responding with countermeasures worth 26 billion euros.
The escalating trade war between the United States and the European Union has sent shockwaves through global markets, with billions of dollars in exports now caught in the crossfire. For context, in 2023 alone, transatlantic trade reached nearly $1.3 trillion, making the US and EU two of the world's largest trading partners. But with Washington imposing 25% tariffs on European automobiles under the new Trump administration and Brussels responding with equal force, the cost of doing business across the Atlantic is skyrocketing. American automakers, energy firms, and tech giants are bracing for losses, while European businesses scramble to find new suppliers. But what is surprising about this situation is that America did not get its own way this time. Europe has just pulled the trigger. This is a counterstrike to cripple the entire US auto industry. Hold tight, you would not want to miss this. The EU's retaliation, targeting key American industries. The European Union has struck back with a calculated and economically potent response, imposing 26 billion euros in retaliatory tariffs on key American industries, intensifying a trade standoff that threatens billions in transatlantic commerce. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen made it clear that the EU would not bow to unilateral US tariffs, vowing to protect European industries and ensure a level playing field. But beyond economic countermeasures, the EU's strategy is as much political as it is financial. By targeting critical agricultural and manufacturing sectors in Republican-leaning states, Brussels is applying pressure where it hurts most. But will it even work? Well, that is what we're going to explore in all thoroughness today. American soybean farmers in Louisiana have already felt the sting, as the EU, previously a major importer, has redirected its purchases elsewhere, forcing producers to seek alternative markets in South America and Asia. The beef and poultry industries of Kansas and Nebraska are similarly reeling, with tariffs making US meat exports uncompetitive in Europe, a market that had once absorbed over $4 billion in American agricultural goods annually. Alabama, Georgia, and Virginia, all heavily reliant on agricultural exports, now face increased costs and shrinking demand for their crops, with projections indicating a 20 to 30% decline in European-bound shipments. Technology and consumer goods are also in the crosshairs, with higher tariffs on American electronics, software services, and luxury brands further disrupting the flow of goods. European leaders have framed these measures as both defensive and retaliatory, arguing that US protectionism left them no choice. So, what can we expect? A repeat of Trump's first trade war. The latest transatlantic trade war feels like déjà vu, echoing the bruising tariff battles of Donald Trump's first term when Washington and Brussels locked horns over steel and aluminum duties. Back then, the European Union had fired back with tariffs on Harley-Davidson motorcycles, bourbon whiskey, and Levi's jeans, targeting not only major American exports, but also industries tied to politically significant regions. This calculated retaliation forced Harley-Davidson to move some production overseas, and whiskey makers in Kentucky raised alarm about steep revenue losses. Yet, as intense as that standoff was, today's trade war is shaping up to be even more economically disruptive. This time, the scale of EU retaliation has expanded, with 26 billion euros in countermeasures aimed at a broader swath of American industries, including agriculture, technology, and consumer goods. The stakes have never been higher, unlike the previous round, which primarily hurt niche sectors. The current tariffs target the backbone of US exports, directly affecting farmers, manufacturers, and tech giants. With global markets already grappling with inflation, supply chain bottlenecks, and economic uncertainty, This latest clash risks exacerbating volatility, potentially shaving off billions from transatlantic trade. The political ramifications also extend beyond economics. Just as in 2018, when American farmers and manufacturers protested Trump's tariff-heavy approach, today's affected industries, particularly in Republican-leaning states, are mounting pressure on Washington to de-escalate. But with both sides digging in and protectionist sentiment running high, a swift resolution appears unlikely. This trade war won't just be about economics. Instead, it could become a defining factor in the next US presidential election, as businesses and voters weigh the costs of another prolonged tariff battle. Then there's the U-turn on Ukraine policy, which has further alienated the European allies of the United States. Things were only made worse with the humiliating treatment of the Ukrainian president at the hands of the new American administration during a diplomatic meeting at the White House. Donald Trump's renewed push to bring auto manufacturing back to the US has reignited tensions in the global trade landscape, but industry leaders warn that this strategy could backfire in costly ways. While Trump argues that reshoring car production will boost American jobs and reduce reliance on foreign supply chains, automakers and economists see a different reality, one riddled with higher costs, supply chain disruptions, and job losses. You see, the auto industry is deeply interconnected, with parts and components sourced across multiple countries, and slapping tariffs on European imports risks driving up the price of production for US automakers. If manufacturers are forced to absorb these costs, consumers could soon face higher car prices, while companies may look to cut expenses elsewhere, potentially triggering layoffs in an industry that employs nearly 1 million Americans directly and millions more in related sectors. Moreover, Trump's aggressive trade stance could also send shockwaves through the global auto supply chain, particularly in regions like the Midwest and the South, where foreign automakers have invested billions in US factories. Delays in key component imports, such as engines, transmissions, and electronic systems, could grind production to a halt, leading to bottlenecks that hurt both American and European companies. A report by the Center for Automotive Research estimated that previous auto-related tariffs threatened up to 366,000 US jobs. This could happen again. As tensions escalate, the American Chamber of Commerce to the EU has issued a stark warning, urging both sides to seek de-escalation before long-term economic damage is done. With European auto giants like BMW, Volkswagen, and Mercedes-Benz operating major plants in the US, any retaliatory tariffs from Brussels could further strain transatlantic investment, discouraging future expansion and innovation. If Trump follows through with his hardline approach, the risk isn't just a short-term spike in car prices. It's a full-fledged economic downturn that could reshape the global auto market for years to come. But can Europe even prosper without the United States? Well, they've been trying at it for a while now. This new trade war is simply a catalyst in this transformation. Europe's long-term strategy, diversifying trade. In response to escalating tariff battles with Washington, the European Union is accelerating trade negotiations with key Asian economies, looking to establish stronger partnerships that could permanently reshape global commerce. China, already the EU's largest trading partner in goods, is at the center of this pivot. Bilateral trade between the EU and China surpassed €856 billion in 2023, and while tensions over human rights and market access persist, economic pragmatism is pushing Europe toward deeper engagement. In addition to China, the EU is expanding its footprint in Southeast Asia, where countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and India offer rapidly growing consumer markets and alternative supply chain hubs. The EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, which came into effect in 2020, has already eliminated 99% of tariffs between the two, setting a precedent for future deals. If Europe's trade realignment continues, the long-term consequences for US economic influence could be profound. Washington has long leveraged its status as a dominant trading partner to exert political and economic pressure. But as Brussels strengthens ties with Beijing, ASEAN nations, and even Latin America, the US may find itself with diminished leverage in global markets. A closer Europe-China trade relationship could also accelerate the internationalization of the yuan, reducing reliance on the dollar in cross-border transactions. This could erode a key pillar of American financial dominance. Beyond manufactured goods and technology, energy markets are also undergoing a quiet but significant transformation. The US has become Europe's top supplier of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, in recent years, particularly after the EU cut its dependence on Russian energy following the Ukraine war. However, with European leaders pushing for long-term energy security and price stability, they are now exploring diversified energy sources, including renewable energy partnerships with China, LNG imports from Qatar, and expanded nuclear agreements with France. If Europe scales back LNG purchases from US suppliers, the American energy sector could face billions in lost revenue, while Asia benefits from a redirection of European demand. If Europe successfully integrates itself into a broader, multipolar economic system, the era of US trade dominance over the continent may be on its way to a historic decline. This may seem far-fetched, but it is not at all. In fact, let's take a look at some major industries to better understand how this trade war is hurting the United States. The impact on the US auto industry. The US auto industry is bracing for significant disruption as trade tensions with the European Union escalate. American automakers are deeply integrated into global supply chains, relying on high-precision European components that are difficult, if not impossible, to replace in the short term. Germany, France, and Italy play a crucial role in supplying essential auto parts, including transmissions, electronic systems, and mechanical components. In 2023 alone, the US imported over $6.5 billion worth of auto parts from Germany, while French and Italian suppliers accounted for another $4.2 billion combined. These imports include ZF Friedrichshafen transmissions, Valeo electronic control units, and Brembo braking systems, all of which are critical to the production of American cars. If the US imposes higher tariffs on European auto parts, the direct consequence will be a sharp rise in production costs, which will inevitably be passed down to consumers. Industry analysts predict that tariffs could add anywhere from $1,500 to $3,000 to the cost of a new vehicle, or even more so, making already expensive cars even less affordable for American buyers. This is particularly concerning at a time when the average price of a new car in the US has already surged past $47,000 due to supply chain disruptions, inflation, and rising interest rates. The impact will be felt most by major American automakers such as Ford, General Motors, and Tesla, all of which have deep supply chain ties with Europe. Ford and GM rely heavily on German engineering for fuel-efficient and hybrid transmission systems, while Tesla sources a significant portion of its semiconductors and battery components from Europe. If tariffs disrupt this supply flow, production costs could skyrocket, delaying vehicle rollouts and forcing companies to seek alternative sources that may lack the same quality and efficiency. Tesla, in particular, faces a severe risk. Its Berlin Gigafactory, which plays a key role in battery production for US and European markets, could become unsustainable if trade barriers disrupt the movement of raw materials and components. Beyond individual companies, the broader economic impact on the US auto industry could be severe. The sector supports nearly 10 million American jobs, from manufacturing to sales, and contributes more than $1 trillion annually to the US economy. Any major disruption could lead to factory shutdowns, layoffs, and declining consumer demand, exacerbating an already fragile economic situation. The American Chamber of Commerce to the EU has warned of severe consequences, urging both sides to seek de-escalation and avoid a trade war. But that is not how things are working out. In fact, the exact opposite is happening. The EU's counterattack, tariffs on US automobiles. The European Union has launched a devastating countermeasure in response to US tariffs, imposing a 25% tariff on American-made cars entering the European market. This move threatens to cripple US auto exports, making it significantly harder for American brands to compete in Europe. In 2023, the US exported nearly 150,000 vehicles to the EU, valued at over $8 billion. With these steep tariffs, demand for Jeep, Ford, Cadillac, and other US manufacturers could plummet, as European consumers turn to domestic brands like Volkswagen, BMW, and Peugeot, which remain tariff-free within the EU's trade network. For American automakers, this retaliation is a massive financial blow. Jeep, one of the most recognized US brands in Europe, sold nearly 100,000 units in the EU last year. Ford's European operations have historically struggled to maintain profitability, and with these new tariffs, Ford's ability to compete in markets like Germany, France, and Italy will be severely compromised. Cadillac, which has been trying to expand its luxury footprint in Europe, now faces an even tougher uphill battle. With prices rising by thousands of euros per vehicle, US brands may be forced to either absorb losses or watch their European market share collapse. The auto industry is one of the most visible and politically sensitive sectors, and the EU's decision to target it reflects the seriousness of the economic conflict. The ripple effects could extend beyond manufacturers, impacting auto suppliers, dealerships, and thousands of workers on both sides of the Atlantic. Given that the automotive industry supports over 2.6 million jobs in the US alone, any prolonged trade dispute could disrupt supply chains, trigger layoffs, and even slow economic growth. So, will the US and EU find common ground, or are they headed for a prolonged economic standoff? With tensions rising and retaliatory measures escalating, global trade stability is at risk. This brings us to another major player in this trade war, China. China's strategic advantage. Ironically, it is China that stands to be the biggest winner in the ongoing US-EU trade war, leveraging the conflict to expand its economic influence in Europe and reshape global trade dynamics. While Washington and Brussels escalate tariffs and countermeasures, Beijing has been actively strengthening its economic partnerships with the EU, offering European businesses a stable, tariff-free alternative to the uncertainties of US trade policy. In 2023 alone, EU-China trade surpassed 856 billion euros, or $930 billion, making China the EU's largest trading partner in goods. As European companies seek to diversify supply chains away from increasingly volatile US markets, China is positioning itself as a more predictable and economically advantageous partner, offering lower production costs, government incentives, and access to its vast consumer base of 1.4 billion people. If European businesses begin shifting supply chains away from the US, the global trade balance could experience a significant realignment, eroding American influence. Key sectors such as automobile manufacturing, high-tech electronics, and green energy are at the forefront here. German automakers like Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz, historically reliant on American imports for specific components, are increasingly turning to Chinese suppliers for batteries, semiconductors, and rare earth materials, resources critical to the electric vehicle revolution. Meanwhile, French and Italian luxury brands, which previously viewed the US as their top export market, are expanding their presence in China's growing middle-class consumer segment, which is expected to surpass 700 million people by 2030. Beyond supply chains, China's deeper trade integration with Europe could weaken the global economic dominance of the United States. One of Washington's key strategic advantages has been the role of the US dollar in international trade, but as China and Europe conduct more transactions in euros and yuan, the need for dollar-based trade could diminish. Additionally, Beijing has been pushing its Belt and Road Initiative as an alternative to Western-led economic frameworks, with $150 billion in Chinese investments flowing into European infrastructure projects since 2013. If China succeeds in cementing itself as Europe's preferred trade partner, US businesses already struggling with tariffs and supply chain instability could face permanent market losses in one of the world's most lucrative economic regions. Talk about quietly capitalizing on the moment. The role of Japan and South Korea. It's not just China, Japan and South Korea also stand to gain significantly in the global automotive sector, capitalizing on the decline of US car exports to Europe. Back in 2023, Asian car makers already accounted for 29% of total EU passenger car sales, a figure that is expected to rise sharply as European consumers turn to affordable, fuel-efficient, and technologically advanced alternatives to high-priced US imports. Japanese and South Korean car manufacturers are uniquely positioned to fill the void left by declining US auto exports. Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, and Kia, already dominant players in the European auto market, are poised for an even greater surge in demand. Toyota, the world's largest automaker, sold 1.1 million vehicles in Europe in 2023, representing a 6.7% market share. Meanwhile, Hyundai and Kia combined for 1.6 million units, giving South Korean automakers a formidable 10% market share in the EU. With tariffs pricing American cars out of competition, these figures are set to increase substantially, allowing Asian automakers to secure a dominant position in the European market. European demand for hybrid and electric vehicles is another advantage for Japan and South Korea. Toyota's hybrid technology has long been a favorite in Europe, with over 80% of Toyota's EU sales being hybrid models. Meanwhile, Hyundai and Kia are leading in EV adoption, with models like the Hyundai Ioniq 5 and Kia EV6 becoming top-selling electric vehicles in multiple European markets. As US automakers struggle with tariff-induced price hikes and supply chain disruptions, Japanese and South Korean manufacturers offer reliability, lower costs, and cutting-edge technology, a combination that makes them highly attractive to European consumers. With the EU market slipping away from US manufacturers, American car companies face a long-term battle to regain lost ground. Ford and General Motors, once major players in Europe, have already seen their presence decline. Ford's market share in Europe fell to just 4.6% in 2023, down from over 10% in the early 2000s, while GM exited the European market in 2017, selling its Opel and Vauxhall brands to France's PSA Group. The new trade war further cements this decline, ensuring that American automakers will struggle to re-establish themselves in an increasingly Asia-dominated landscape. This shift is also reflected in manufacturing investments. Japan and South Korea are ramping up EV battery production facilities in Europe, further strengthening their integration into the EU market. South Korea's LG Energy Solution, Samsung SDI, and SK Innovation have collectively invested over $13 billion in European battery plants, supplying automakers like Volkswagen, BMW, and Renault. Similarly, Toyota's European manufacturing footprint, with plants in France, the UK, Turkey, and the Czech Republic, allows it to avoid tariffs altogether while expanding production closer to European consumers. If the trade war continues, this power shift could permanently alter the global automotive landscape, with Asian automakers solidifying their role as the preferred choice for European buyers. Of course, at the direct expense of American car makers. But this is not the extent of the problem at hand for the United States. The energy sector and geopolitical shifts, the escalating trade war between the US and the EU, is also triggering a fundamental shift in global energy markets. Europe, once heavily reliant on US liquefied natural gas, is now exploring alternative suppliers and renewable energy investments, posing a long-term threat to American energy dominance. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the EU took drastic steps to cut its dependence on Russian gas, turning instead to US LNG as a primary alternative. By 2023, the US supplied nearly 50% of Europe's LNG imports, with exports surging to over 56 billion cubic meters, a 141% increase compared to 2021. This shift made the EU the largest buyer of US LNG, accounting for more than 70% of total American LNG exports. However, this reliance on US energy has come at a cost, with European leaders wary of the high prices and geopolitical risks. Now, with increased US-EU trade tensions, Europe is accelerating its search for alternative energy partners. Qatar, which signed a 27-year LNG supply deal with Germany in late 2023, is emerging as a major competitor to the US, while Australia and Algeria are also expanding their LNG exports to European markets. If the EU further pivots away from American energy, US exporters stand to lose billions of dollars in annual revenue, permanently altering the global energy trade balance. The decline of US LNG exports to Europe could cripple American energy firms, forcing them to compete in more volatile and price-sensitive markets. Companies like Cheniere Energy, ExxonMobil, and Chevron, which have heavily invested in LNG infrastructure, could see their profits shrink as European demand diminishes. Additionally, US natural gas prices, which have been buoyed by European demand, could collapse, leading to reduced domestic production and job losses in the energy sector. The EU's aggressive climate policies pose another challenge to American energy companies. The European Commission has signaled that it may tighten environmental regulations, imposing stricter methane emission limits and carbon footprint requirements on LNG imports. Given that US LNG has one of the highest carbon intensities among major suppliers, American energy firms could soon find themselves locked out of the European market altogether, not just due to trade tensions, but also because of environmental compliance barriers. Europe is, after all, accelerating its transition to renewable energy, reducing its overall dependence on fossil fuels. The EU's Green Deal, which aims for carbon neutrality by 2050, has already spurred record investments in wind, solar, and hydrogen energy. In 2023 alone, Europe invested over 400 billion euros in renewable energy projects, with wind and solar accounting for over 70% of new electricity capacity. If this trend continues, US oil and gas firms face long-term disadvantages as Europe's demand for fossil fuels steadily declines. American energy companies could struggle to find alternative buyers for their LNG, forcing them to cut production or pivot towards less lucrative Asian markets. Meanwhile, European clean energy firms, along with competitors in China and South Korea, stand to dominate the next phase of global energy innovation. One can say that the current trade conflict has accelerated a long-term shift, pushing the EU towards more sustainable and geopolitically secure alternatives. If American policymakers fail to adapt, US oil and gas firms could find themselves permanently sidelined. But it doesn't stop here. The technology and semiconductor industry. Presently, US companies dominate chip design, European firms lead in semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and Asian manufacturers handle large-scale production. But this balance could be upset. For decades, the US and the EU have been close allies in technology, collaborating on cybersecurity, AI, semiconductor research, and digital infrastructure. The European Commission has historically aligned with US policies on key tech issues, including intellectual property protection and cybersecurity standards. However, the latest trade conflict threatens to fracture this alliance, potentially leading to a decline in joint research and development, particularly in semiconductors, 5G networks, and AI. A rift could also reduce cooperation on high-performance computing and cybersecurity, weakening both regions' defenses against cyber threats. Additionally, increased barriers for US tech firms operating in Europe could result in stricter regulations on data privacy, AI ethics, and digital markets, making it harder for companies like Apple, Google, and Microsoft to maintain their stronghold in the European market. The European Union has already signaled a shift toward greater digital sovereignty, aiming to reduce reliance on US technology. The EU's Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act are just the beginning of a broader regulatory framework that could restrict US firms' dominance over European data and infrastructure. If trade tensions escalate further, the result could be a gradual decoupling of US-EU tech industries, reshaping the global technological landscape. But wait, there's more from where that came. Long-term consequences for global alliances. The ongoing US-EU trade war is no longer just a dispute over tariffs. It is evolving into a full-scale economic battle with far-reaching consequences. What began as a disagreement over trade policies is now transforming into a prolonged standoff that threatens to reshape global economic alliances. The stakes are enormous. Bilateral trade between the US and the EU amounted to over $1.3 trillion in 2023, making this one of the most significant economic disputes in modern history. If the trade war continues to escalate, it could lead to prolonged uncertainty, with businesses delaying investments and multinational corporations shifting their operations to avoid the effects of tariffs. The longer the dispute persists, the more likely it becomes that global markets will adjust permanently, potentially reducing the US's role in the European economy in favor of China and other emerging markets. Beyond the economic battlefield, the trade war is straining broader diplomatic and security ties between the US and Europe. Historically close allies, both sides have long cooperated on key global issues, from NATO defense commitments to joint climate change initiatives such as the Paris Agreement. However, growing economic tensions could weaken transatlantic unity, making it more challenging to coordinate on matters of geopolitical importance. European nations are already discussing increasing their defense spending independently of the US, raising concerns about the future of NATO's strategic alignment. Additionally, the EU's shifting energy policies signal a broader move away from American influence in critical sectors. On climate policy, the EU's commitment to green energy and strict carbon regulations could create further divisions, especially if US industries face additional trade restrictions due to non-compliance with European environmental standards. These growing fractures could encourage rival powers such as China and Russia to exploit divisions, further destabilizing the global balance of power. World leaders, businesses, and financial markets are closely monitoring the situation, as prolonged hostilities could reshape long-standing trade and security alliances. Some analysts warn that if tariffs remain in place for an extended period, it could take decades to rebuild trust between the US and Europe. The European Union has already begun exploring closer ties with China and Southeast Asian economies, raising the possibility that the West's traditional economic order could be permanently altered. If a resolution is not reached soon, the trade war could accelerate the emergence of a multipolar world economy, where the US no longer holds its dominant influence over European trade and policy. Whether Washington and Brussels can find a diplomatic off-ramp remains to be seen. But one thing is clear: the longer the conflict continues, the more difficult it will be to repair the damage to the transatlantic alliance. And the biggest tragedy? No one will win this trade war. Consumers, from middle-class American car buyers to European households reliant on affordable US goods, are bearing the brunt of these policies, with rising costs limiting purchasing power and diminishing economic stability. Automakers, retailers, and manufacturers face mounting challenges, as higher tariffs not only increase prices, but also reduce competitiveness in foreign markets, leading to job losses and potential economic contraction. The longer this trade conflict drags on, the greater the risk of a recession, with businesses delaying investments and consumers cutting back on spending. A prolonged impasse could also redefine global economic alliances, with Europe seeking stronger ties with China and other Asian markets, while the US finds itself increasingly isolated. Without a strategic diplomatic resolution, this trade war could trigger an economic downturn that extends well beyond tariffs, reshaping industries, trade policies, and financial markets for years to come. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.